Hello there, everyone. My name is Martin Perez, and I'm going to be presenting my Keystone entitled There's No Business Like Show Business, Analyzing Accessibility and Artistic Quality on Broadway. A little bit about me. I'm a senior, obviously, studying public relations in the College of Communication with a minor in theater arts in the College of Fine Arts. And for those of you who don't know me well, I'm a big theater kid. Most people who've met me in class are very much aware of that fact. And so my Keystone serves as an interdisciplinary combination of my professional and personal interests in public relations as well as theater. And these are some fun pics of me doing theater. So with my Keystone focus, I really had two major research points which I was trying to look at. The first one was an analysis towards the ways in which Broadway has changed over time to reach its current state where it's at right now, and also an analysis, in the inverse relationship in the ways in which promotional strategies have changed over time in order to appeal to changing audiences, as well with that, looking at the inverse of that, how audiences on Broadway have changed in regard to how Broadway shows have adjusted the ways in which they promote their shows. So a little bit of background about my project. This started in 2021 when we were still pretty much largely in the middle of COVID and Broadway was shut down. And during the shutdown, there was a lot of time of reflection and looking at, where the state of the industry was, where we wanted to go from here and how we want to improve. And so that's kind of where my research stemmed from. So at the time, there was a large concern about an overgrowing sense of commercialism in theater. There's a large over-reliance on adapting musicals from other previously acclaimed sources of media, whether that be movies, TV shows, the works of artists or authors or things like that. So here on the right, for example, you can see just a couple of examples of some of the Broadway musicals being created recently, which are all obviously adaptations. And so this is a tactic used to appeal to a larger audience of consumers, which has its pros and cons, which I'll talk about as well. But with these changes come concerns towards the desires of Broadway producers and theater makers overall. They see this lack of originality as a result of producers pandering for profits, wanting to make money and just putting anything on the stage, and really just prioritizing making money over making authentic or really hard-hitting work. And so there's this conflict between wanting to make theater accessible to an everyday consumer and to anyone who wants to see theater, but also wanting to make sure that we're producing quality work and making things that are important and not just to make money. And so with my research methods, there was a really dual combination of the two. There was a theater history lens approach as well as a communications approach. So primarily looking at primary and secondary sources, historical archives, scholarly works, things of that nature, to build a historical framework of Broadway. As much as I would have loved to look at all of the history of Broadway, that is so much, and I could have written so many papers on that. So I had to narrow it down looking at a time period from about the 1970s with the creation of the concept musical, which I'll discuss in a second, to the present. And additionally, I was supplementing that with interviews with industry experts as a way to gain more insight into how Broadway promotional strategies have changed over time and why. So just to give you a brief historical framework of what I was looking at, these are trends, so obviously not a complete picture, not a full, this is what happened 100%, but just to give you a little bit of a framework. So I started looking in the 1970s with the development of the concept musical. A concept musical is essentially a musical about a concept. So it's really just based around a theme or a message more than a narrative plot. So we're not necessarily going from point A to point B, but we're rather trying to build this theme or idea across. So for those of you in the audience who are aware of musicals, some examples of this might be A Chorus Line, Company, Sweeney Todd, other musicals of that 1970s era. Flash forwarding a little bit to the 1990s, we start getting into the development of the mega musicals. So these are musicals which are really big and showy. So we have a lot of spectacle involved, and it's really just trying to attract audiences visually, bringing them in with big technical aspects, big showy lightings and set pieces and costuming and all kinds of fun things visually. So in the 1990s, this was really present in a lot of different musicals, including Phantom of the Opera, Les Miserables, Cats, other musicals of that nature. Going a little bit more forward, and this is less of a trend and more of a kind of different era when we start seeing Disney on Broadway. So Disney comes along, and we still have a lot of that same aspect as mega musicals, where we're getting these big spectacle shows, but we're starting to appeal more towards a noticeable shift of attracting families to Broadway. For the most part, before that, Broadway had really been, first of all, elitist in the sense of for the old and the white and, things like that, which obviously we still have issues with, but also more for adults. It wasn't very family friendly. It wasn't very tourist friendly. It was really also a little bit snobby in that sense as well. But especially with the presence of Disney on Broadway, we start noticing that shift towards wanting to attract families and also just everyone to Broadway. So here's when we start seeing musicals like Beauty and the Beast, Lion King, Wicked, musicals of that era. And then from there, we start looking at contemporary Broadway, which is obviously where we are now. So obviously, it's hard to set this exact trend right now, but just kind of through my research, trying to look at where we are now and where we're going to continue to go, or where we want to continue to go. And so looking at that, we have our outcomes of what I'm hoping to do with this project, and obviously there's no clear-cut answer or solution to the questions I'm being researched. It's not very black and white. I can't say this is bad, this is good, this is what we need to do to make it better. It's very much subjective. It's hard to say even, this is a good Broadway show, this is a bad one, because so much of it is up to personal opinion. But really, the work will be useful in finding ways to create work which is both accessible, while also still maintaining a sense of meaningfulness and making sure we're creating work which people are passionate about and is authentic and not just trying to make money. And obviously, my work doesn't work to fix the issues being discussed, but rather more just to shed light on them and offer insight and recommendations as to how to help our industry move forward in a way which allows this more meaningful work to be created. And thank you. I'll take any questions.
Congratulations on a great presentation. I kind of wanted to ask about the role of conversations of like gender inclusivity, because I know it's like a very, very like recent topic, especially with like the upcoming Tony Awards and like Some Like It Hot, like it's very recent. So I'm wondering how that kind of has impacted your research and especially your understanding of current trends on Broadway.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and like you've mentioned, obviously it is very new. This is something that obviously people have been talking about for a while, because obviously gender diversity has been an issue for a while, but it's been more of an issue specifically on Broadway and being discussed probably in the last, 2 to 5 years, very little. So it's hard, and it's something that's interesting to look at, and obviously there's not really a clear-cut answer, and there's a lot of change that needs to happen in order to help make Broadway diverse, both in that sense and in a lot of other senses of diversity as well. And so that's something that definitely, not even necessarily gender diversity, but obviously that's a factor of it, but just diversity in general, how that comes into play on Broadway has been a large part of my research, and looking at the ways in which, how can we make it more diverse, and how can we make sure that everyone can feel included and welcome on Broadway.
Great presentation, Martin. I was just wondering, based on your research and what you are finding, what do you think the future of Broadway will be? Like, do you think it will continue this trend of like the Mean Girls, like, very very popular musicals, or do you think it's going in a different direction?
That's a great and a very loaded question. I think it's really hard to know, but I think the way I feel, and I think is a big sentiment that I've noticed a lot, especially just being involved in the community and, having discussions about the community, is that people are growing tired of this sense of, another adaptation of another movie or another work that's based off another work. So, I'm hopeful that maybe we can move past that and, not even that it's fully bad 100%, but just to get some more original ideas out there would be great. But, it's a great question. I guess we'll see as it continues.
What would you say has been the most rewarding part of the research process so far?
Theater is something I'm really passionate about, so I could talk about it for, forever, and, I do a lot. So, this project has been great because it's a way to kind of, it was a way to talk about things that I was already thinking about and talking about, and just researching more into it, and maybe making some more academic research into it as well, which is great for me personally, and I think also great for the field, because there is research in the field, obviously, but it's very mismatched, and there are a lot of different pieces that I helped put together with this project.
So I wrote a whole chapter about Hamilton and Shuffle Along, but I'm especially interested in Hamilton. Like, where does that fit into your timeline? It just seems like such an exception, and yet it is obviously the obsession?
Yeah, Hamilton is obviously a big cornerstone of the 2010s of, Broadway, and it's helped make a lot of different strands and different, a bunch of different things, diversity in what we're seeing on Broadway, the sound of Broadway, what we can do. So obviously it has been a huge influence, especially in the last decade or so. So it definitely does tie into my work a lot in a lot of these aspects of how do we make Broadway more accessible. But it also ties into, the other ways of, how do we make meaningful work? Because that is still an adaptation of some sorts. It's based off a book and things like that. And so it also kind of helps show that not every adaptation is bad, and that, as I mentioned, there's no clear-cut answer as to how to solve these things that we're talking about.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful presentation from a fellow musical theater fanatic and fan of Broadway. I feel like you could argue that there might even be another shift happening, or at least I've noticed there's a lot of revivals this season and past season. Like, I think some of that might be paying homage to the passing of the maestro Stephen Sondheim, but Into the Woods, Sweeney Todd, Camelot, Parade, like, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, or if you have any on, like, just the fact that there's so many revivals happening.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, because in a way, it almost to me seems like another way of adaptations, because it is, building this work that people already know and just recreating it again. And sometimes it can be good, I think, in the ways in which we do recreate these works and we bring them to life in new ways and we make new concepts with them and we do something fun with them. But I think a lot of times also it can be really negative in the sense of which is like, people like this show, let's do it again, we'll make money. So it's a double-edged sword as well, just like a lot of the other things I've discussed. But I do think that is an interesting trend that I've also clocked and discussed a lot about, for sure.
Your research for this may not have covered my question, but maybe you can bring your own personal experiences in this.
Sure.
So your presentation obviously is centered around Broadway, which is a for-profit corporation. Like, it is meant to make money, so they do these big flashy musicals that they know people will attend. In your personal experience or even in your research, have you found significant differences between the movement of what's happening in Broadway and the phases versus what is happening in nonprofit theater and regional theaters, where the risks and the mission are different?
Yeah, totally. Broadway is a whole different ballgame from basically any other theater-making group ever. And I think something that I've talked about a lot, especially with like my theater minor and things of that nature, as well as looking at, for Broadway, obviously there's stakes in trying to make money, but for smaller theaters, regional theaters, nonprofit theaters, and things like that, sometimes it can be hard because it's a matter of, if this show doesn't do good, we don't have money, we need to close down, which, is also a case on Broadway, but normally less so. And so there is an added pressure, I feel like, often with like nonprofit theater and smaller theaters to be like, not only what do we want to do, but what do our audiences want to see, because we need that money to stay afloat. And so that can be a tricky other thing to look at as well with smaller theaters.
Your dream role.
Oh gosh, that's so hard. I have many. First one that comes to mind, Seymour in Little Shop of Horrors. I would love to play that role. I recently played Paul in A Chorus Line, which is another dream role, but there's so many.
Well, thank you so much, Martin, for that fantastic presentation.
Thank you.